It's often said that the burning of the Library of Alexandria is one of the biggest crimes ever committed against humanity, and that the library's burning was an event that possibly set the course of humanity back by 1,000 years or more. Alexandria's library was a beacon of ancient scholarship and wisdom and philosophy. It would have been an awe-inspiring marvel as described through the ancient sources. The ancient sources describe it as a vast collection within the Museon, which was part of Alexandria's campus, a center for intellectual pursuits housing the greatest ancient works from the known world, whether they are Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and even beyond. Letters from scholars like Aristeas suggest that it held hundreds of thousands of scrolls meticulously curated, aiming to encompass all human knowledge. Its halls were filled with philosophers, poets, and scientists. They fostered debates and made discoveries. The library's ambition, we know from ancient accounts, was not just to store this ancient knowledge within these scrolls, but to translate and preserve it for global wisdom, making it a vibrant, unparalleled sanctuary of wisdom, higher scholarship, philosophy, invention, and the understanding of the natural world. And in today's lesson, I'm going to tell you why the Library of Alexandria was built, how and why it was destroyed. I'm going to try to shed some light on what we know may have been lost from Alexandria's library. And I think this is something that you're going to find pretty fascinating and hopefully develop a newfound appreciation for ancient Egypt's last great era. Hey everyone, let's pause the adventure for a sec. You know, life's a wild journey, and cutting your way through the jungle or marching through the desert, spending weeks or months away at times can be hard and sometimes very lonely. But I often find that it's everyday life that takes the biggest toll on you, and there's no lonelier feeling than feeling like there's no one you can talk to, or you feel like you can't express yourself to anyone around you. Maybe you wish you had some neutral person to talk to that can give you some clear and helpful advice. Well, that's why today's video is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp can connect you with a licensed therapist so you can feel more comfortable talking about things like anxiety, depression, or even something that I deal with personally, loneliness. With BetterHelp, you have someone to talk to anytime, anywhere. It's affordable and it fits to your schedule. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/Luke Caverns below to get 10% off your first month with BetterHelp today. And thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the show. Now, most of you are probably already going to be familiar with the basic, understood, and traditional timeline of ancient Egypt, where around 3100 BC, you have the formation of the very first dynasty. And this begins the early dynastic period, which leads into the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period that lasted about 150 years, then the Middle Kingdom, another intermediate period, then we have this golden age known as the New Kingdom with all of the famous pharaohs that most of us are probably aware of, including Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Amenhotep, even King Tut. The list goes on and on. But after this New Kingdom period, Egypt really begins to fade into history. It becomes more of a backwater of the Mediterranean. Every other culture has finally, after over 2,000 years, now risen up around ancient Egypt and formed this Mediterranean trading network. Now, the Egyptians, what made them powerful was the Egyptians being the center of the world. Everyone came to Egypt. Egypt went to nobody. So as civilization expands into the Bronze Age and people start trading at distance, well, Egypt again starts to fade into a lowly backwater until it's largely one of the most unimportant civilizations in the greater Mediterranean region. It's conquered by the Assyrians and then the Persians, and right at the end of the Persian conquering of Egypt, a young man from ancient Macedon at 23 to 24, 25 years old marches through the Persian Empire and conquers it over the course of just a couple of years. And then he arrives in Egypt and names an ancient city after himself, known as Alexandria. Now, of course, I'm talking about Alexander the Great. When Alexander came to Egypt, one, he needed to, just for purely military reasons, he needed to secure a western edge of his newly found empire, or newly conquered Persian Empire. Now, Egypt is known as the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. It's where most of the grain came from throughout the Mediterranean world, and it would later feed Rome. But right now, it was feeding the Persian Empire. So to have a reliable food source to feed his men, he needed to go in and conquer Egypt. Now, while he's there, he has this other side quest, you could call it, that he wants to go on. The legend goes that every night, Alexander would go to bed with the works of Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey beneath his pillow, as well as a dagger. Now, in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey in particular, Odysseus finds himself washed upon the shores of Egypt, and he finds himself in the small fishing village, and he asks the locals where he has shipwrecked on, or where his ship has banked, and they tell him a place called Pharos. Now, they could have been saying Pharaohs. This could have been, a mistranslation or a miscommunication, but nonetheless, Odysseus discovered a place called Pharos Island. Now, this was something that Alexander wanted to go find for himself. When he first arrives, he travels directly down to Memphis and then continues his way up the Nile Delta until he gets to the Mediterranean coast. Now, again, the Egyptians were not sea people. They lived directly on the Nile. I think this is a common misconception. Most people, when they think of ancient Egyptians, they think of people who wander around in the desert riding on camelback. That's not the life of an ancient Egyptian. The ancient Egyptians lived in the green, fertile, beautiful, tropical oasis that was right along the Nile. They lived right on the river, probably within 500 to 1,000 yards of the river at any given time. They did not go to the desert, and they also did not go to the Mediterranean Sea. So we do not have these large, great cities right there on the Mediterranean coast because the Egyptians have no business being out there. Also, the Nile Delta kind of acts as a protective barrier between potential invaders from that sea until they get down into the heartland of Egypt. So they have to navigate their way through the Delta before they can get to the government capital of Egypt, known as Memphis. Alexander goes up the Nile to the Mediterranean coast, and as he's going along the coast, he doesn't really see anything other than fishing villages, and he comes along this place called Ra Kotis, which is right where modern-day Alexandria exists today, and he finds this small island called Pharos. And while he's looking at the island and he's looking at this little strait of land that existed along this fishing village, his Greek mind, the Greeks love to build their cities and temples on the water. This was a very Greek thing. The Greeks sort of opened up to the rest of the world. They wanted to expand their horizons. So it's a very Greek thing to see this narrow strip of land and realize, oh, if I build a city here and I have one port on one side and a port on the other connecting to this lake on the south side, this is a very fortified area. It's strategically advantageous. Alexander doesn't have any chalk in his bag, and he goes over to one of his horses and he grabs this grain out of the saddle. He lays the grain on the ground and he essentially maps out the ancient city by hand. So the ancient Alexandria was literally drawn by Alexander's hand, was planned out by his hand. And so he has these two main roadways known as Soma Road and Canopic Way, and they were aligned with the ocean breeze, and they were planned to be 100 feet wide, which was much wider than any known ancient road at the time in the middle of a major metropolitan area, you could say. And so they were meant to be 100 feet wide, and they faced towards the sea breeze. So when that cool Mediterranean wind would sweep in from the ocean, it would sweep right down these 100-foot wide streets in the middle of town. So effectively cooling the town, and allowed many people to travel through the middle of town to get where they were going. So completely revolutionary idea as far as ancient cities are concerned. So he maps the ancient city out, and he gets his architects to stay behind at this newly founded city of Alexandria to begin building it. Well, sure enough, these seabirds come in and they just eat up all the grain that he had just laid out. And he looked at his men and he thought that this was a bad omen, but his men calmed him down and reassured him that this meant that his city, this newly founded Alexandria, was going to feed many, many people in many generations. And they were absolutely right. So Alexander leaves his newly founded Alexandria on that day. And he eventually goes off to conquer the rest of the Persian Empire and eventually attempt to invade into India. And he never returned to Egypt again and never returned to his city. He died in Babylon at about the age 32. And when he's on his deathbed, his successors, his generals, his close friends go up to him and they ask him, who do you want to hand over your empire to? As he had no fitting heir, no heir ready to take over. And essentially, as the story goes, his final word was to the fittest. So it's pretty vague. So they essentially chop up and divide Alexander's empire, and Alexander's closest friend, Ptolemy, who was very interested in the Egyptian world, was given Egypt to govern. Well, essentially, this breakup of Alexander's empire doesn't go very well. The successors start warring against each other over who feels they deserve to govern over this land. Each of these different divisions of Alexander's empire turns into their own kingdoms, and eventually Alexander's good friend Ptolemy has to declare himself the new pharaoh of Egypt, and essentially this Greek family that was put in charge of governing this province of Egypt is now marooned in Egypt. They're not welcome to go back to Greece necessarily, and they have to essentially rebuild the Egyptian empire or the Egyptian kingdom. So Ptolemy declares himself pharaoh of Egypt. Now, he's in a precarious place because Ptolemy is not Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was determined by the Egyptian priests to be the son of the god Zeus Amun, which is essentially just a morphing of the high Greek god and the high Egyptian god into one. He goes off to see this priest in the Siwa Oasis, and he has to go through this rite where this priest, this oracle, essentially determines that he is in fact the son of the high god Zeus Amun, or in terms of what the Egyptians cared about, just the son of Amun. So now he is the physical embodiment of the god himself. He is a living god, and in general, he's just a miraculous man who is able to conquer the world's largest known empire in his mid-20s, basically in a sitch. Now, Ptolemy was not Alexander. Ptolemy knew that. Everyone in Ptolemy's royal cabinet knew this, and the Egyptians themselves knew this as well. So Ptolemy's in a precarious situation. He has to, one, be a great ruler, because the Egyptian people, they don't really like being ruled over. They did not like being ruled over by the Assyrians. They did not like being ruled over by the Persians, especially not by the Persians, who the Persians' emperor shows up in Egypt and slaughters the Apis bull, stabs it to death. The sacred Apis bull, one of the most renowned, prolific gods of this later Egyptian period. He essentially disgraced the Egyptian world, and so the Egyptians were not big fans of being ruled over by non-Egyptian people, and they could be very rebellious and cause lots of issues. So Ptolemy has to take a different approach. He has to win over the Egyptian people and prove to them that Egypt can return back to this level of greatness that it once had in such a distant past. Now, this is around 310 BC. Just to keep in mind, the youngest date for the Great Pyramids is about 2450 BC to 2500 BC. So this is now 2,200 years. 2,200 years since the Great Pyramids were built at their youngest approximate date. That's an insanely tremendous amount of time. Now, think about the Egyptian during Ptolemy's time. You're living in the shadow of the pyramids that harken back and remind you of this long ago primordial age when ancient Egypt used to rule the world. And they were essentially the only emergent great ancient civilization that was, even at their youngest date, was achieving things long before the rest of the ancient world was even putting together stone houses. So Ptolemy makes a decision to show the ancient Egyptians that Egypt can be that great once again. Now, he doesn't really get started on it in his lifetime, but his son, Ptolemy II, does. Ptolemy II takes on the two largest projects that make Alexandria what it was, that made Alexandria iconic and famous. One is the Lighthouse of Alexandria. The second was the Library of Alexandria. Now, the lighthouse was essentially hearkening back to the story of Odysseus essentially becoming marooned or shipwrecked or landing on the island of Pharos. What the lighthouse was symbolic of was that this was a beacon of hope, of enrichment, of enlightenment, of opportunity for people throughout the Mediterranean world. And it also showed that this was a safe place to dock your boats. It was a symbolic statement to not only Egypt itself, but to the rest of the Mediterranean world. Now, the Lighthouse of Alexandria was within just a few dozen feet of being the same height as the Great Pyramid, and it was built by, through what the ancient sources tell us, 65-ton red Aswan granite stones, of which some of these are just now being pulled up from the harbors of Alexandria. But when I was there back in October and then again in January, I could see these large stones sitting just a few feet under the water's surface. So the lighthouse must have been absolutely enormous and completely stunning. But making it essentially the same height as the Great Pyramid while being something unique and individual in itself, what it was doing was telling the rest of the Mediterranean world that Egypt is now returning to this sense of greatness. And it's also telling the Egyptians that, look, even though we are Greek, Macedonian pharaohs ruling over you, look what we can turn Egypt into. We can return Egypt back to the empire, the legacy, greatness that we all long for, that sits in the back of our minds and overshadows us on the Giza Plateau with these great pyramids. We are now returning back to this golden age. That's not to say that the Egyptians were not wrapped up in literature, philosophy, and science. They almost definitely were, but it must have been something that was more sacred and more well kept in secrecy than it was in the Greeks, who publicly published their works or allowed people to come into universities such as in Athens and listen to philosophers and teachers speak. But the Greeks also tell us in the pre-classic Greek periods or the late Dark Ages that their understanding of science and philosophy actually originates in Egypt. So it's this interesting situation where you have Greeks who intellectually are sort of raised by the Egyptians into the classical period and then returning into Egypt and then helping raise the Egyptians again. And this is the Library of Alexandria. The library, we think, was 2 floors tall, and it was built out of massive solid white fine-grained Tura limestone as well as red Aswan granite, which again is coming from probably 600 to 700 miles south in modern-day Aswan. So it was a tremendous building project to build the lighthouse and the library. Now, there is a library in the city of Ephesus that was built during the Roman period, I believe around 200 AD. And so the story goes that the facade of this library is actually based on Alexandria's library, or was inspired by it. Now, we don't know that for sure, but it at least gives us an idea of what it looked like, and it's actually the basis for Assassin's Creed's Library of Alexandria facade as well. Now, Alexandria's library was meant to be a hub of scientific discovery, poetry, philosophy, astronomy, the understanding of the natural world. It was supposed to be a hub of intellectuals coming to Alexandria and making the world's greatest discoveries. Now, when you arrived in Alexandria and you got off the dock, it connected to, I believe, either Soma Road or Canopic Way, that one of the main streets that ran more or less north and south inside the city. You would dock there, but the dock also walked up into the library. So you would have, let's call them police officers. You would have soldiers who are stationed there that would essentially board your boat, and all of the writing that you had on board would be confiscated and would be copied down in the library. And they would tell you that they would give you back the originals and keep the copies, but actually what they would do is they would give you back the copies and they would keep the originals for themselves, because the Ptolemies were absolutely obsessed, like many people are today, with having the original copies of different text, books, and manuscripts. So, and this is something that eventually blows up into what's called the Library Wars, where you have the Library of Alexandria, Ephesus, and Babylon, and there may have been others that are all competing with each other to be the greatest curators and arbiters of these original copies of ancient works throughout the Mediterranean world. It's a really fascinating thing that happens during the Hellenistic period. And for anyone watching who doesn't know, the Hellenistic period is essentially all of the world that was directly affected from Alexander's campaign conquering the Persian Empire and spreading Hellenism. So Hellenism is essentially just Greek culture. So it's a fascinating era of time. The Hellenistic period is just fascinating. Now, it's commonly thought that the burning of Alexandria's library was just one single incident, but in reality, it was actually multiple instances over the course of almost 400 years of turmoil between the Romans and the Egyptian people. Now, the first time that this occurred was in 48 BC when Julius Caesar accidentally set fire to the Library of Alexandria when he instructed his men to burn the docks. Now, he was chasing Pompey's fleet across the Mediterranean, and to prevent them from fleeing, he burned their ships and burned the docks. But like I said a moment ago, the docks were right next to Alexandria's library. So the fire essentially crawls up the docks, it crawls up the ropes that are connecting the roofs of the ancient buildings and the ships, and essentially crawls up into the library. And that while the library, as well as most of the buildings in Alexandria, were made out of stone to prevent fire, the wooden floors and the wooden cabinets that held all of the scrolls, as well as the scrolls themselves, just immediately went up in flames. Now, there are a lot of historians that, for one reason or another, and I often wonder if it's just because sometimes historians are obsessed with myth busting and making things seem like they're not as dramatic or significant as they really were, try to say that most of the library was not actually destroyed and that it really wasn't that big of a deal, that the library was already in disrepair and that people weren't using it enough. But that doesn't seem to align with what we hear later on. When Julius Caesar eventually passes away and Cleopatra falls in love with Julius Caesar's cousin, Mark Antony, Mark Antony then gifts Cleopatra over 200,000 scrolls back into the library, essentially to make up for the loss of what had happened many years before. So this was probably something that was a very, very, very big deal that deeply affected Cleopatra and hurt her. And so we have this gift from Mark Antony that kind of tells us that something really bad happened to the library, probably something much more than just a small little incident. But that's not the end of the story of the destruction of Alexandria's library. Not even close. About 230 years later, so that's 230 more years that Alexandria's library still remains active and that people are coming to study in the library and make discoveries. 230 years. That's an extremely long time. That's almost the amount of time that the United States of America has been around. So anyways, in 215 AD, Caracalla gets wind that the comedians who are essentially putting on shows in the theater of Alexandria. So you have this big open theater. Now, comedies had been a thing since the classic period of Athens, let's call it around 500 BC. Now, this is now 215 AD, so 715 years later. Comedy theatrical or comedic theatrical performances had been around for a long time, but stand-up comedy was now emerging, where essentially a jokester or a clown of some kind would stand at the bottom of the theater facing towards the audience and would just tell jokes at people's expense. This is something, as far as we know, emerged in Alexandria itself, and the Alexandrians were pretty noteworthy for having dark, bleak humor. And the Egyptians themselves, the Egyptians in general, loved making jokes at people's expenses, including the Roman emperor. So they were constantly cracking jokes about the Roman emperor Caracalla, calling him short, saying that he had little feet, saying that he was a terrible emperor, just anything that people of the day would have found funny at Caracalla's expense, because Caracalla doesn't live in Alexandria. He lives in Rome, which is all the way across the Mediterranean, and he's probably never going to hear these jokes that these just peasants and normal people are cracking about the emperor. Well, they were absolutely wrong. Caracalla did catch wind of this, and Caracalla is not really the guy that you should mess with. So one day he arrives on a royal visit to Alexandria in 215 AD, lines up a bunch of people in the middle of the street and slaughters 25,000 Alexandrians over the course of just a couple of days and burns down the Royal Palisade area, which, as we know from the ancient sources, was connected to Alexandria's library. So the library burned, the Royal Palisades burned, the Museum burned. Probably the only thing that didn't was Alexander's mausoleum, which sat right across the street from Alexandria's library. But you can just imagine the chaos here. So this is now the second time that we know of that Alexandria's library was burned and was affected. There may have been a different second time in between this when Augustus sieged the city, but we don't have direct sources, as far as I know, that tell us that Augustus directly affected Alexandria's library. Now, just about 50 years after Caracalla's siege of Alexandria, or essentially just his burning of Alexandria and slaughtering of 25,000 normal people, we have the Emperor Aurelian, who shows up to essentially, there's a local Egyptian who declares himself the new pharaoh, and he rises up to reignite ancient Egypt. Well, the Roman Emperor Aurelian isn't having any of this, and he has to come squash a rebellion that's taken over Alexandria. So in doing this, he burns down the palisade again. He kills all of the rebels, including the Egyptian who has now declared himself the new pharaoh. And in doing this, he burned down the entire palisade, including Alexandria's library again. And then in the year 365 AD, off the coast of the island of Cyprus, one of the largest earthquakes in recorded human history, so within the last several thousand years, occurs. And it sends a shockwave ripple effect tsunami through the Mediterranean that hits Alexandria like a freight train. The ancient sources describe the waves as coming over the 35-foot walls, as completely towering over the walls and spilling into the city, bringing in all the boats that were in the docks up over the walls, riding on top of a wave, and then crashing down onto the rooftops of the city itself. Now, the ancient source Pliny tells us that at the end of this cataclysmic event, there were at least 50,000 Alexandrians who had completely gone missing. And it's also after this event that we utterly, completely lose the location and never hear of again the location of Alexander's body or the Library of Alexandria, which, by the way, were some of the first buildings that would have been hit during this tsunami. So you have this cold Mediterranean water spilling over the walls, completely submerging Alexandria's library, the museum connected to it, washing across the street into Alexander's mausoleum, down under the ground, completely destroying Alexander's tomb, probably his physical remains as well as all of the other Ptolemaic pharaohs that were buried down there with him, submerged the entire underground portion of his burial chamber, and knocked down that building, knocked down the Library of Alexandria, knocked down the museum, completely destroyed all of the buildings around it. And when the water eventually recedes away, 50,000 people are now killed in the rubble of what was formerly ancient Alexandria. And Alexandria, as the ancient world had known it, no longer existed. And the stones that made up Alexander's mausoleum, as well as Alexandria's library, were picked up and turned into something else. And ever since then, we no longer know the location of Alexandria's library, the museum, or Alexander's mausoleum, and they completely fade into time. That itself was probably, well, definitely is the definitive destruction of Alexandria's library, which was caused by rushing water. It was caused by a tsunami. Most people think it was caused by a fire. This is probably a story most people have never even heard of. Now, what do we know was lost in Alexandria's library? The ancient sources tell us that there was up to around 700,000 scrolls kept in the library, individual works, I should say, at any given moment. And that anywhere around 90% of it no longer existed by about the year 500 to 1000 AD. So 90% of those 700,000 scrolls were completely lost to time, whether that was due to the multiple burnings of Alexandria's library or whether it was from the tsunami of 365 AD. We just don't really know, but an incredible amount of work was lost. But Are there any clues or hints or even specific mentions in different works that do survive that call back to works that must have existed in the library? Can we identify things that we know we no longer have access to or no longer exist, but definitely did used to exist? So probably one of the most famous ancient works that no longer exists, but is mentioned and used as a source in so many other ancient sources, is the works of Ptolemy I, who is Alexander's best friend that campaigned alongside Alexander. It's essentially an account of the life of Alexander's best friend and everything that he achieved during Alexander's lifetime and extending beyond that well into his old age. If anybody has seen the Colin Farrell Alexander movie, when Ptolemy is sitting in the palace of Alexander and he's walking around talking about the days when he was younger and what it was like to be with Alexander, that is him writing his works that are lost to history today. If we had that book, it would completely revolutionize and utterly, completely change the way we view Alexander the Great and the way we view the earliest days of the city of Alexandria from the man who was responsible for building Alexandria and making it this great golden city that it would become later on. The next is Callimachus Pinake's 120 volume catalog of every single scroll in Alexandria's library. Think about that. A 120 volume catalog of every single work that is in Alexandria's library. If we had his 120 volume catalog, we almost wouldn't even need any other source, because that would explicitly, it's a catalog of all the works that were in the library. Imagine if we had that. Imagine the things that we would now know used to exist. The Alexandrians were definitely studying Egypt's earliest history. We have small fragments of surviving papyrus where we can see that Greek scholars were studying the Great Pyramids, that they were studying the dimensions and the secrets of the pyramids. There's no telling all the things that they were interested in, capable of achieving, things that they discovered on their own about ancient Egypt itself, things that they must have been privy to that we have absolutely no idea of. If this 120 volume catalog still existed, oh man, it would change everything. The next we have Aristarchus of Samos' heliocentric treatises, which essentially prove that the Earth orbited around the sun almost 2,000 years before we give credit to Copernicus for discovering. After this, we have Manetho's History of Egypt that was written around 300 BC, so in the very earliest days of Alexandria's library. I should say we have small fragments of Manetho's History of Ancient Egypt that is actually so accurate that at no point during the history of Egyptology have we ever discovered anything that went against Manetho's History of Egypt. So there's no telling what kind of insights that somebody living in 300 BC, who is more than twice as close to the age of the pyramids or the age of the Old Kingdom as we are today, there's no telling the kind of insights and profound knowledge that Manetho must have had of ancient Egypt. If you could read a modern translated version of Manetho's History of Ancient Egypt today, like you can with the histories of Herodotus or other works like Plato and Aristotle, oh man, that would be amazing. And the next thing that's lost, which I think may be one of the most enticing things to many of you guys, is that there are lost histories. Just like Manetho's History of Ancient Egypt, people don't realize this. There were other historians there that had gathered all of the knowledge from around Persia and had put it and written it into papyrus. There were entire histories of ancient Persia all the way up to Alexander's conquering that were written in Alexandria that don't exist today. And going one step further, there were historians that were actually in India that were gathering knowledge of ancient India and writing that into a history of India. So all the way out to India from Egypt, we were having histories being written that are completely lost to us today, that were lost either in the burning of Alexandria's library or the tsunami just completely finished everything off. And finally, we have absolutely no surviving text written by any of Alexandria's pharaohs whatsoever, including Cleopatra herself, who grew up avidly visiting the library and learning Egypt's history as well as multiple foreign languages. But I want to leave you with just a few quotes from ancient sources that talk about the grandeur of the city of Alexandria, Alexandria's library, the importance of it, how many books it had, and what was going on in the library. At Alexandria, the books of the philosophers and physicians were collected, and those who studied them became renowned for their learning. The city has most beautiful public precincts and royal palaces, which cover a fourth or even a third of the whole area of the city. For just as each of the kings added some adornment to public monuments, so also he would invest himself with a residence in addition to those already existing. All are connected with one another and within the harbor, even those that lie outside of the harbor. The Museon is also a part of the royal palaces. It has a public walk, a theater with seats, and a large house, in which is the common mess hall of the men of learning who share the Museon. This group of men not only hold property in common, but also have a priest in charge of the Museon, who formerly was appointed by the pharaohs, but now by Caesar. Besides this, there are many lofty temples, and especially the Serapeum, which, although no words can adequately describe it, yet is so adorned with extensive columned halls with almost breathing statues and a great number of other works of art that next to the Capitoleum, it is the most magnificent building in the whole world. In it were libraries of inestimable value, and the unanimous testimony of ancient records declares that 700,000 books brought together by the unremitting energy of the Ptolemaic pharaohs were burned in the Alexandrian War when the city was sacked under the dictator Caesar. I'm Luke Caverns. Let me know what you think may have been lost in the halls of Alexandria's library, and please like and subscribe for more videos on the history and mysteries of the ancient world.